What's up guys, this is Joseph with Slidio Studios, and today we're going to be talking about ND filters, why you might want to use them, and some tips and tricks while using them. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So before we get started, let me explain what ND filters are. So essentially what ND filters are like sunglasses, but for your camera lens. So they help lower the lights coming in through the camera lens. So why you might want to do this, you may ask. Don't we want as much light as possible? Well, on a lot of shoots, especially when you're outdoors, it's actually way too bright for your camera sensor, and you have to do one of two things. The first thing that you may have to do is to lower your aperture, so you might be shooting at an f11. Now, when you lower an aperture to something very high like an f11 to compensate for the sunlight, you don't get any kind of bokeh at all. So this means that your background and your subject are very, very clear in focus. And this could mean one of two things. First, the image itself doesn't look very cinematic. One of the easiest way to distinguish between amateur looking footage and cinematic footage is if you have any kind of bokeh, also known as blur background. Now with an aperture like an f11, you're not going to get any bokeh at all. And most importantly, the second reason, it's really hard for your viewers to pay attention to the subject. When you have bokeh, which can only be achieved by opening up your aperture to something wider than an f11, you essentially blurs the background, which prevents any distraction and kind of puts your subject in focus. This is really important because in a lot of video work, when you have stuff moving in the background, it's really, really easy to get distracted. So let's say that you don't want to lower your aperture and you want to continue shooting at the same high aperture. This is achievable if you increase the shutter speed. So the only other way to do this, assuming you're on the minimum ISO already, which you most likely are, you will have to increase the shutter speed. Now you can increase the shutter speed as much as you want and you still get the same shallow depth of field. But as you increase the shutter speed, the image starts to look very, very choppy because now the sensor is capturing more image per second than what it was doing before. Now this does not change your frame rate. It's very easy to confuse the frame rate and the shutter speed. This doesn't change your frame rate. This just means that each second that it captures through the frame rate is going to look a lot more choppy. It's almost like you're taking a photo per picture, and this just doesn't look very cinematic either. And this is actually how a lot of phone cameras adjust its exposure, because on a phone camera lens, it typically doesn't have much aperture control. So the only way to actually allow less light in the actual sensor to prevent overexposure is by increasing the shutter speed. So a lot of times when you record footage on your phone, it will look very choppy. The motion doesn't look very cinematic. So for a natural motion blur, we typically recommend double the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, which is what you need for cinematic video, then we would try to achieve a shutter speed of 1/60th. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you can go all the way up to 1/120th. So those are the two main reasons why you may want an ND filter. Because without an ND filter, you either have to decrease your aperture or increase your shutter speed. Both results in undesirable image quality and makes your image look very amateur. Now, when you're shopping for ND filters, what they will usually measure in density levels, or sometimes they'll be measured in f-stop, but density levels is usually the most common. So density levels refers to how much it darkens the image by. Now, the higher the number is, the darker that ND filter is. Typically, I recommend an ND filter of around 0.9, which is not a lot, but the reason I like 0.9 is I can use them in multiple applications just using one filter. So in daylight applications, using an ND 0.9 may actually not be dark enough to widen the aperture, but I can still widen the aperture to something like an f3.5 as opposed to an f11. So that can give me that nice shallow depth of field. The other thing is when it becomes sunset or when it's not a cloudy day, these ND 0.9 are not too dark. If you were to get something with a higher density value, then you're going to get a very underexposed image during cloudy or sunset situations. These tend to work well in those situations as well. So I find ND 0.9 to be a really nice mix between not being too dark when in those cloudy situations, but also not being too bright in direct sunlight. But you could also just get a full kit of these. There are also ND filters that are adjustable. I typically don't recommend those because they are 2 layers of glass, and when you have more layers of glass, it basically affects the quality. You're essentially adding more glass, and that's just gonna affect sharpness and, like I said, the quality. So I just typically don't recommend those. I would definitely recommend more of like a kit of these. Now, speaking of quality, the quality of the ND filter is also really important. A lot of times you're gonna find on Amazon, their ND filters are about $10 to $20, really, really cheap. They look good. I mean, you can't really tell when you're just looking on an Amazon image, so you might just buy those. And typically what happens is they're just a really bad quality glass, and you have to think about this as you're essentially adding an extra glass on your lens. So the quality of this glass is really, really important. And when you buy those cheaper ND filters, they're just gonna look really washed out. They're gonna affect the colors, the contrast. Most of the time, they're just gonna lower the contrast by a lot, and they're just give you a very, very ugly flat image. So you want to make sure you get good brands. I typically recommend Tiffin, B&W, and also Polar Pro. So I'll put a link in the description. There's a lot of brands that make good quality ND filters. Just make sure to check the link in the description and get it from them. Now, one last thing I want to talk about in terms of tips and tricks is that you want to make sure ND filter is spotless. Again, you're putting this on your lens, and if you have any kind of dust in the inner layer, not only would it get trapped in, it would also be really easy to pick up, especially when you're filming for glare and stuff like that. And also any kind of smudges can create ugly looking spots on your image. So you just want to make sure they're really nice and clean throughout. So you want to make sure, again, the actual lens itself is clean. You want to make sure the inner layer and the outer layer are both spotless so that you can get those nice sun flares and those contrasting images without seeing those smudge marks. Now, for indoor shots, I basically never use an ND filter, and as just like a sunglasses, right? You wouldn't really wear sunglasses indoors. You won't be able to see much, unless if you want to look cool, then that's up to you. But I don't think your camera needs to look cool indoors with an ND filter. It doesn't really look that cool anyways. So it's just too dark to really take advantage of an ND filter. So you just have to remember taking them off. A lot of times what actually happens is I'll have my camera from outdoors and I'll bring it inside, and then I forget that the ND filter is on. I'm just like, oh, why is this image so dark? So yeah, you basically never use an ND filter indoors, and there's no real purpose to using them anyways. And the last thing that the ND filter actually provides is it actually provides an extra protection, because this is a glass, just like a glass screen protector, for example. This is an extra piece of glass in front of your lens, so that if you were to bump into it, if you were to drop it, or whatever happens to it, it's much better to break this $70 piece of glass versus your $1,000 cinema prime lenses, for instance. So yeah, it just adds that extra protection. And of course, it won't give you that protection when you're indoors, but typically when you're indoors, your lenses are not going to be under the harsh environment of outdoors. So yeah, that's just you wouldn't really get this just for the purpose of protection, but that's also another added benefit. So I hope you find this video helpful. I kind of want to just go briefly into ND filters. There's a lot more to talk about in the future video, but I just want to sort of talk about the basics. There are also polarizer filters. There's polarizer ND filters. There's a lot more to talk about, and they're just not just used for video cases. Of course, that is the most common use case, but they're also used for things like long exposure for photography to get those nice motion blur. And if you guys are interested, just comment down below, and maybe those are things that we can talk about in the future. But again, for this video, I just want to briefly talk about this, how you can use them to make more cinematic shots and stuff like that. So I hope you found this video useful, and I hope that for the next time when you do shoot outside, you use these ND filters to really give you that cinematic look. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time with another video.